I'll start with a few. Ambassador Goldberg, let me start with you. I sometimes worry that American foreign policy has become dangerously sclerotic. We sanction our enemies and we sell weapons to our friends. While other countries that are often adversaries like China or Russia have a much more diverse toolkit at their disposal with which to try to gain influence. You spent some time as the North Korea sanctions coordinator, and you're going to inherit an even more robust set of sanctions on North Korea, given the announcements from the Biden administration in the wake of the latest ballistic missile tests. Just interested to hear your assessment about the efficacy of our sanctions regime, given the fact that Americans with just a passing interest in world affairs haven't helped but notice that these devastating multilateral sanctions haven't seemed to have had any practical impact on the conduct of the North Korean regime. Interested to hear your take on this question.
Senator, I think sanctions work, but they're not a policy in and of themselves. They have to be accompanied by other elements of U.S. and world influence and power. They have to be multilateral without much leakage. In some cases, and in the case of North Korea, the lack of tie-in to the international financial system and trade make it more difficult in some respects, easier in others, to enforce sanctions. You have to have a population that has a say in what is going on in their country. There are other examples of sanctions elsewhere that have worked more quickly to influence public opinion, but there is no public opinion in North Korea. So it's a very difficult, hard target for sanctions. All of that said, North Korea wants those sanctions lifted, which is a reason to keep pressing because they want them lifted for a reason. And they want to have their cake and eat it too in terms of not being forthcoming on negotiations, which we've offered without preconditions. So they are an important element, but they're not an element that will necessarily do the trick by themselves.
Ambassador Kennedy, I wanted to draw for a moment on your experience in Japan. Here's how the editor of one of the most significant Chinese Communist Party-run newspapers described Australia. He said, Australia is chewing gum stuck on the sole of China's shoes. Sometimes you just have to find a stone to rub it off. He said this in the context of a pretty significant row between China and Australia, driven by an increasingly hostile and muscular diplomatic presence and set of activities from the Chinese government inside Australia. And this is, of course, the story all throughout the region. The Chinese are willing to do things and say things, employ more aggressive tactics in a way that they were not 10 to 20 years ago. And I'd just be interested to hear a little bit about what you learned during your time in Japan about the increasingly aggressive diplomatic tactics of the Chinese and how you'll take those learnings to this new job.
I think what I've seen is that the things have really changed and increased in the region, the tensions, since my time in Japan. All the countries out there have dealt with each other for a very long time, but certainly Australia most recently has been challenged by Chinese economic coercion, and I think that the United States can learn a lot from their response. They've stood firm, and I think they've managed to come together with a bipartisan foreign policy, and I think a greater and deeper partnership with us in the security and diplomatic areas, as well as across the board, that will serve our country and theirs well as we move forward into this increasingly tense time in the Indo-Pacific. So I look forward to working with the Australians and with the Japanese to secure a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Did you see an increase in the sort of virulence of these tactics while you were in Japan, or do you think that some of this happened more recently?
I did see it, but I think it has become much more widespread, much more public, much more open. There were the South China Sea issues were certainly present. Some of the economic coercion was certainly happening, but I think all of that has become more dramatic since in the last 5 years.
Great. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Carlson, I think a number of us have been surprised and a little disoriented by